Hi, I am Jeffrey Warnick. I'd like to welcome everyone to newest episode of PodChute. I'm very happy to be having a conversation with my friend Richard Miniter. And Richard he'd sent me just several days ago a video of an interview he had on another podcast that got extremely well reviewed by the people who watched it. Many people watched it, said it was one of the most interesting conversations they've seen on the internet with respect to an understanding of our current political situation. So after I watched the video, I also thought it was a very, very interesting video, and I would encourage everyone to watch the video. Later, Richard can tell people where to find the video, so they watch that besides our conversation today. So Richard, I'm really pleased to have you on. I also was familiar with the background of your conversation. I have read several of David Hackett Fisher's books. I find them very, very interesting, but I also have some differences from the points that you made during the interview, which is your interview on the other podcast. So I'd like to discuss that with you today. But first I would like you to introduce yourself, your background, and why don't you give an overview of the conversation that you had to that audience, and you can share that with this audience, and then we can begin our conversation. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, great.
Well, my name is Richard Miniter. I've written 3 New York Times top 10 best-selling books. I was at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, both in New York and in Brussels. I was a columnist at Forbes for a while, and I have made a personal study of history. I've lived in various countries around the world. I was a war zone reporter in the late 90s, publishing articles in The Atlantic and Reader's Digest, The New Republic, and other places. So I've had a kind of wide and varied journalism career, both as a journalist and as an executive. I was on the executive team that did the turnaround at the Washington Times, making it profitable for the first time in 38 years. That was very much a team effort. I'm not saying that was all me. On the other podcast, which is on track to pass 500,000 views sometime today.
Wow. Congratulations.
Well, it's amazing what the audience is interested in. I met those guys completely by accident, and they were brought along by a friend, and they were asking questions about America, and I gave them my answers, and they had just never heard of David Hackett Fisher or these ideas before. And so they invited me on the podcast, and about 2 months later, they aired it. So it's doing very, very well. I get a lot of positive comments, much to my surprise. One of the hosts wrote me a note saying, "I tell my guests never to read the comments, but in your case, please read the comments." And I never read the book reviews of my books, either on Amazon or various newspapers. So I reluctantly took a look at the comments and was very pleased to find, I think people are very hungry for ideas that are outside of Team Red and Team Blue. And there is just more to life than rabid partisanship and assuming that one side has all truth and the other side is consigned to outer darkness. That's a very Manichaean view of the world that misses a lot of nuance and a lot of great things. And if you instead look at the world, that there is all of the great debates have reasonable people on both sides. You may disagree with their premises and their reasons, but they are reasoning, and they have, and so the more you can try to understand their ideas with sympathy and with fair-mindedness, the more you can at least understand where they're coming from, whether they persuade you or not, and often they don't. But it's good to understand what is driving them, what is driving other people in the world. And I think there's a large and curious, independent-minded audience out there, and I think that's why the podcast was so successful.
Oh, Richard, I want to ask you this question. You use the term where they're great debates. What topic do you think? I mean, we have great disagreements. We have great differences. What topic do you think today we are having really great substantive debates on?
None.
Okay.
maybe this will be the first, Jeff. I mean, We spend a lot of time in these arguments trying to ascertain basic realities, like, is this a fact? Is that not a fact? Those are dumb debates, right? Things are either facts or they're not facts, right? And we don't have, this isn't the 19th century, right? Where the Disraeli debates with Gladstone, I'm talking about two different British prime ministers here, the conservative and liberal wings, who argued powerfully about whether renters should vote, or whether what rights workers would have vis-a-vis factory owners, the role of Ireland, the role of free trade. Great debates in which reasonable people could be on either side. And there are no debates like that in American life today. And I would say in European life either, right? The one side wants to ban the other side from speaking. So they're silencing debates, not engaging in them.
You think Teddy Cruz is going to have the type of correspondence with Jamie Raskin that Thomas Jefferson had with John Adams?
I think they're both capable of it, but due to financial forces, how they raise money to run for office, and the kind of media that they both need in order to survive politically, both the media and the money mean they can't do it. But are they both intellectually capable of it? I would say they are.
So would that mean that you conclude that Jefferson and Adams were intellectually honest about their differences in debates, and given the realities of politics today, there's very little intellectual honesty?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jefferson and Adams had their own fortunes, right? I mean, Jefferson's was a bit shakier, right? And therefore, they knew that their livelihood did not turn on their political office, and they could weather the storms of disagreement. I think because, especially for elected candidates, their access to media and their access to donors constrains what they can even think, let alone say. And they also don't get exposed to certain ideas. We've designed a system to be pointlessly adversarial, as if the courtroom between a defense and prosecutor is the best way of organizing our political life. And it just isn't.
No, there's a difference, though, between a courtroom and the halls of Congress. The fact is that in the courtroom, whatever anybody says, they swear an oath to tell the truth, right. And can be charged with perjury for lying. Once you get on the witness stand, and here the politicians have no accountability for the words that they say, and no consequences for falsifying their preferences and being intentionally intellectually dishonest.
Right, but what I'm saying is that the political model should not be the courtroom. It should be the dinner party, where people are free to say what they think. They're free to listen to ideas outside of their experience or their philosophy, and they're also free to test ideas, to try things out, and learn that way as well. Instead, we have the courtroom where the client is either completely innocent or completely guilty. And that is simply not a truth-seeking mechanism. It's seeking a kind of truth, but the kind of truths courts find is, does this behavior of the client or of the defendant fit this pattern, right? And if we can make it look enough like that pattern, we can send him to jail or take $100 million from him, or do whatever the other side wants. That is simply not a good mechanism for figuring out what's going on in this complex society of ours and what's the best way forward. I think it's a little closer to a dinner party, where even the person who might come from a small rural district and raise little money might have a powerful idea that other people can adopt. And maybe even the guy from the richest district with the best access to media should listen, at least for a minute.
To me, your answer implies, and maybe it was not the intention of it to imply, because I think our bigger problem is not money and the corrupting influence and the realities of philosophy. I think the Constitution was never designed for us to reach a national consensus on every single issue and have every issue to be a national issue, and to have the expectation that we could reach a consensus on every issue, and that every issue had a national solution to it, and that every problem is a national problem to it. This is why I find interesting, your point about, going back to your interviewing on the other podcast and your reference to David Hackerfish's work. It's very interesting to talk about the fact that different regions had different cultures. But to mediate between all those cultural differences, between the Cavaliers and the other groups that that you mentioned, that came over and early and colonized the United States. The fact is that almost no issue had to reach a national consensus. So the one group had one geographical location very rarely had to convince another group who had a different culture on anything, because almost no issue was a national issue. There was very limited issues that were, now everything is a national issue. We had, to give context again, and I say this numerous times, up until 1913, which is the date I use as the death of the Republic.
The Black Year, my grandparents used to call it.
Was the year that we got the Fed, we got the income tax, and we got direct elections of the senators. So we nationalized politics. Up until that point in time, before we had phony money, fake money, corrupt money, the dollar, when we were really, when we really were linked to some sort of, metallic standard that limited the discretion of monetary policy. We had government federal government was very small. It was 3% of GDP, 3% of GDP, more or less, was the federal government, and total government spending was about 6 to 8% of GDP, as opposed to right now, it's about 40%, a little over 40% of GDP. And that doesn't include the influence government has through the regulatory state, which that was also almost non-existent. So the federal government had very little influence, over people's day-to-day lives and the functioning of the economy. It had really very, very little consequence. And so there were not many issues you had to lobby the federal government over, because for the most part, the federal government had no money. So it really was, there was no, politics was all local. So the action was lobbying your mayors, lobbying your governors. That's where the action was on local politics. It was on national politics. So there were not many issues that really a national consensus had to be agreed upon.
Right. Let's go back to 1783 for a moment, right? So the Treaty of Paris is signed, ending the American Revolution. Or was it the Treaty of Ghent? Anyway, it was in 1783. And I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. But from that time, 1783 to 1789, the beginning of the Constitution, the founders went home, right? For the most part, they went home.
Right. We had the Articles of Confederation.
And you had the Articles of Confederation, which in theory is a beautiful document, right? The states have enormous power relative. And what happens is corruption at the state level infects the national body politic. States, which have their own, the banks in the various states have their own currencies. And some states have wild inflation, New York and Pennsylvania particularly. Connecticut passes a law that allows debtors to sue creditors, right? And the whole national government becomes just an arm of state-level corruption. And in horror, the founders say, oh, we've got to go back. We're going to have to launch another revolution.
Right.
And that
was Madison. When Madison recruited Washington, Madison's main point was the state issuance of fiat money. That was the most important point to Madison, was the state issuance. Hamilton had a different issue. Hamilton wanted to pay back the debt. So Hamilton wanted to pay down the debt, and Madison wanted to end the issue of state issuance of fiat money, which is why the Constitution banned government issue with fiat money, which is our monetary regime today, and regime today that our founders, when they created the Constitution, told us, adopt this monetary regime, and I guarantee the result will be tyranny. So, and the debasement of money. And since we've had the Fed, they've been proven right. We have a much bigger government, and we've had significant debasement of our money. I don't know if people know, but even during the inflation of the War of 1812 and the inflation of the Civil War, if you took a look at the price history from 1800 to 1900, that basically for that 100 period of time, the 19th century, we ended up having, I think the number makes some question, is I think we had a 1% deflation over 100 years.
That's right.
So we not only did we not have no inflation, ultimately for that 100-year period of time, we just had a small percentage of deflation when we were not on a fiat money regime.
Right. And let's take a look at what sound money meant for the 19th century, right? So there's two things that virtually no one talks about that is worth a closer look. One is we know that inflation is tied to all sorts of negative social indicators, such as divorce rates, sex before marriage rates, drug use, alcoholism, and so on, because money is a proxy for the human being understanding time. And when these two things come out of balance, people and inflation creeps up, people become very short-term in their thinking, right? And if you want a good case study of this would be that people are more familiar with is Weimar Germany, which as it climbed toward its peak hyperinflation in 1924, you saw divorce rates and promiscuity skyrocket, and other social maladies and suicides too, by the way, go up in that period, right? So there is social effects to fiat money that no one talks about. But the other more important economic aspect of the dangers of fiat money is that when money was backed by gold or silver or some metallic basis, and it was stable, people could enter into long-term debt finance for real estate, which opened up access for land, farming, factories, homes, in which they could have very long-term mortgages that were paid back, and the creditor could be assured that the value he received 50 years later would be of roughly equivalent value to what he had lent. And so, of course, there'd be monthly payments or quarterly payments, depending on the instrument. And that meant that society was a lot more stable. People in the bottom of society, with a stable currency, could borrow safely and acquire assets and build upon them and build society as a result.
That's why during the 19th century, when there were futures markets and option markets, but the futures and option markets were not necessary for financial instruments because there wasn't that type of volatility, that we have today because of the type of things where people did hedging activities were agricultural products.
Yes.
Because that's the vicissitudes of the weather. Do you have good seasons or bad seasons? So that's an issue of the supply being very unpredictable. So depending upon how successful the harvest is. So
hedging was a form of insurance.
Hedging, so they hedged that. But so basically in the 19th century, the only thing people were really hedging were agricultural products because of the vicissitudes of the weather and its impact on how much supply would be available, into the market. So so now we need all sorts of type of financial engineering because we have so much volatility, and we have so much volatility because of fiat paper money. Has had the financialization of the world is associated with a fiat money regime, and it was not necessary under a regime of sound money regime. And while in the 19th century, we had many bank failures, the losses, even though there was no FDIC, there was no insurance, there were uninsured deposits, there was no third government agency, that none of it didn't exist. The deposit losses were very small because basically the banks were very heavily capitalized. They were capitalized by like 20 to 25% capital. And generally, the run on the banks began while the banks still had positive equity. So on the most part, there was, since a lot of the lending was actually inside related party lending, as I say, generally the people were, since the bank owners were, lending to their own projects. If the projects went bad and they knew it was going bad, they would start withdrawing the money from the bank, and they would want other people to withdraw the money in the bank, because at that point in time there were not so much limited liability laws, and they could be personally responsible for paying for depositor losses. So without any government regulation, other than them being responsible for having liability for losses they cause on third party, a lot of banks failed, but a lot of banks failed that were just marginally insolvent and causing very low losses to depositors, really minuscule losses to depositors. And even during the Great Depression, most of the bank failures were in banks that adopted unit banking laws. So, the bank. So if you had a problem in your local economy, your city where you resided and where you could bank, and you could only bank in that thing, you could not diversify your risk. So the local economy went bad, the bank went bad, and there was no way of diversifying your risk, and there was no way of hedging your risk, because the government prevented you from doing that. So most of the bank failures occurred because of just bad government policy, and that if banks had been allowed to, diversify the risk, then there would have been significantly less failures. So these were not market failures. These are not failures of capitalism. These are failures of either government regulation or this unsound, fiat money regime, which John Exeter, who was a friend and advisor to Paul Volcker, called the money nothing. So that's what he called fiat money, was the issuance of nothing. So so the sound money. So it was the issue of sound money that was that was the issue that really prompted Madison to convince Washington to convene, the Constitutional Convention.
Yes.
So you want to go on from that point?
Well, I think sound money is important for numerous legal, moral, and economic reasons. But I think, there's a guy named George Washington Plunkett, I believe his name was, writing in the late 19th century. He was a machine politician. He was, and he said that it was a better world where people didn't know their federal representatives. Because for most of the 19th century, people had no idea who their senator and congressman was and didn't care. And the reason why is that what the federal government did was considered not very interesting to the ordinary person, right? It didn't touch their lives. What the government was focused on is the administration of federal courts, the handling of Western lands, and the defense infrastructure, which was very minimal before World War I, and that kind of thing, right? There was not a big role in the economic or the cultural life of the people on behalf of the federal government. The idea that the federal government would regulate what books go into libraries, the federal courts would hear cases about what books go into libraries, would have been incomprehensible to not just the founders, but to anybody before the early 20th century, because like, wait a minute, this is a private decision, or if it's a public library, it's a public decision for the people in that town who pay for that thing. And why is there a national policy? We now have national building codes in the United States, where a body sets the basic minimum standard for a building across the United States. Well, all right, that includes American Samoa, by the way. So what makes sense in a typhoon, in a region which might experience typhoons, might make no sense at all in Alaska or in North Dakota or in South Carolina, right? A single one-size-fits-all policy is generally a bad idea, except when you're talking about things that need to be stable across the entire economy, such as weights and measures, such as currency, such as rules of evidence in federal courts, right? We can't have different rules of evidence in different federal courts. That would be leading to gaming of the system. Right. The idea of a federal police force, an FBI, for example, would be incomprehensible here. So, they would be strange to hear. They would be surprised to hear the word, but most Americans prior to the progressive era in the early 20th century were minarchists. They thought the federal government should do the minimum. They were minimum viable government, right? Like you have this Silicon Valley has minimum viable product, minimum viable national government. And they understood something about the nature of the political class, that George Washington, I think, put it best when he says that if you have no government is like a fire. If you have no government, you're dark and cold. But if you have too big a fire, it burns down your house. And so the idea here is the political class needs to be limited in its reach. It needs to do a very few things. It needs to do those things exceedingly well. And today we have in every industrialized country, we have a political class that does not limit itself in any area of human life. It decides what a man and a woman is. It decides who can marry who under what terms. It decides what the value of money is. It decides every tiny human decision. And that is the opposite of freedom. And to make things even worse, this political class is frequently impenetrably stupid. It has such a limit in its experience to draw on. Its frame of reference is very narrow, and it has no curiosity about the world beyond it to try and learn before it regulates or legislates or controls. And so, I mean, to use the phrase from the poet E.E. Cummings, it's a very busy monster.
So would you agree with my statement that there are many things that the Republicans and Democrats have in common, that they're mostly dumb?
Yes. Well, we don't actually
dumb, that neither party has much regard for the Constitution.
That's true too. But do we want smart people in government? You know, I was once asked on Congolese TV what I thought of the government of the Congo. And I said, well, I think you run a very poor country. And they said, well, have you been here recently? And I said, well, you have all these people with PhDs and MBAs in your government. That tells me that you have a very poor country and a very poor government. Because in a successful country, smart people are in business, dumb people are in government. And in a poor country, smart people are in government and dumb people are in business. So I don't want to see a smarter political class. I want to see one more limited in its reach, but I want to leave the people who are truly open-minded and creative in the private sphere where they can compete with each other and offer products and services that improve the lives of the largest number of people possible.
Yeah, I used to when I would give talks at to some universities, and some students would ask me questions about, you know, me as a young entrepreneur and hiring practice and things like that. I would tell people, you know, if I have a choice between a dumb person who knows they're dumb as opposed to a smart person who might be very smart, but they're not half as smart as they think they are, even though they might be very smart, I'll take the dumb person. And I explain for this reason. A dumb person knows they're dumb, will stick within what they know well, which is limited, which means they're not going to make you money, but they're not going to lose you much money, because they're not going to do something beyond the scope of what their perception of their own talent is. So they're not going to take much risk. A smart person who might be extremely smart, but then thinks they're 10 times smarter than they actually are, they're going to take stupid risks, and they're going to lose you money. So you basically got to hire people who are pretty good about assessing their skills. And many people, and you generally get really smart people tend to think that they're a lot smarter than they think they are, even though they're very smart. So so they're the ones that are going to get you, into a lot of trouble. Just think about all those people who thought they were brilliant designing all those financial products that basically bankrupted Wall Street and required, trillions of dollars of bailouts, and think about how Enron was considered, the smartest people in the room. Yes, it might be true. They might be very, very smart, but if you're very, very smart, but not as smart as you think you are. And most people who think that they have the problems, they have the answers to every problem. Elect them, and they will solve every problem, because they have a unique wisdom that is so unique that basically they process information better than the marketplace does, even though they have no evidence that they have that skill. Because if they had that skill, they would be trading money, and they'd be worth, multiple trillions of dollars. because if you can beat the market, you should have that type of network. If you consistently beat it, because you have a wisdom and knowledge that foresees things that even the markets don't see. So if you don't have that, you have no evidence that you're any smarter than markets. And if you're not smarter than markets, why are you making decisions in contradiction and conflict to how markets would make allocational decisions?
Exactly. But also, I think your analysis of dumb versus smart people, you need to come up and consider another variable alongside it. So,
Which is?
the dumb who follow instructions are great.
Yes.
The dumb who are ambitious and launch attacks to try to take over the organization and think they have a better way. It's the dumb but
It's the dumb who don't acknowledge they're dumb. That's the problem.
Well,
The
maybe
dumb
they
person
do,
who
maybe
knows
they
they're
don't.
dumb won't do that.
Right. Those are the most dangerous people because they don't know their limitations and yet they have an imperial sense of themselves. A smart but humble person might be the best because while they could be extremely insightful and therefore make you money, they're not going to try and take over the business. I'm thinking here of like the typical Silicon Valley where there's just people who just want to write code. They just want to build amazing software. They don't want to run a business. They're great to work with. Engineers can add a lot of value. They can be very smart, and a dumb engineer is almost useless. But it's the ambition that's not matched to intelligence. That is the biggest problem. The smart but ambitious can be destructive, but they usually leave and go start their own thing. Mm-hmm. And so they're the second most dangerous. The absolute most dangerous are the dumb, self-confident people who would rather blow things up if they can't control it.
Yeah. So I just think, as a general principle, maybe it's the gap between how smart or dumb you really are versus your own perception of how dumb or smart you really are. And the bigger the gap, the more dangerous you are, and the more ambitious you are, about exploiting your perception of your own unique ability that you really don't possess, is the more likely you're going to inflict damage on a lot of other people. And and I think that it's one of the reasons why our founding generation wanted a limited, decentralized government, because then you don't have what engineers like to avoid in a fragile system is a single point failure. So design this. So an engineer will tell you don't want to have a system where if one thing screws up, the whole system collapses. So you have to have redundancies. So we know to have anti-fragile systems, are systems that are decentralized, not centralized systems. Centralized systems are very fragile. So and so I think, with all, while I thought, I think David Fisher's observations are really interesting. I thought your interview was really very interesting and worth seeing, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you today. I think the biggest flaw of our society today, is the fact that we've nationalized every decision. So we've created a fragile system, and that's why the disputes. That's why people think there's so much at stake, because it's not like, gee, what, I want to live in this type of culture and I'll move to this state or this city or this town. It's like I can't escape the federal government. It's going to impose its will everywhere. So, and people want that. In the past, people did not want a strong central government. Now people want a strong central government. So they want a big government. They want a strong central government. And they don't only want to have the government make their lives better. They want to have people govern other people who don't live in their neighborhoods, who should have no impact on their day-to-day life, and yet they want to govern other people who live in other jurisdictions, as far as state or local jurisdictions, and they want to impose their will on other people rather than just have the government help them when they think they need help. So I mean, that was something that was not common in the 19th century, where people were looking for national solutions to all problems, and they wanted to have a president that would impose that solution on everyone, even if there was a group of people who didn't want that solution imposed on them. That was an antithetical concept then, and it's not an antithetical concept today. So, so there's a problem, and this is a problem, not a Republican problem or a Democrat problem. There's a problem with both parties have this approach that both parties want to nationalize, everything. Like you talked about two different groups of people, the accountables and the unaccountables. That was something I wanted to specifically comment on.
Before we get to that, can I just respond to what you said earlier? I just want to say,
go ahead.
Things. First of all, I think the founders gave us a constitution that is a lot like the internet. The internet is resilient and strong because it's decentralized all the way down to its atomic level, where things are broken into packets and then reassembled at their destination. The internet is designed literally to survive an atomic war, right? You can take out multiple nodes and the internet still survives. Bitcoin is a bit like that, in that because of the distributed ledgers, it's hard. You can't just take it out with one blow, right? It's not like the movie Independence Day, where you take out the enemy flying saucer and all the other flying saucers crash to the earth, right? It's a decentralized, therefore resilient system.
Right.
That's what the founders gave us. And we've spent 2 centuries, maybe 2.5 centuries, making that system less flexible, more fragile, overburdening it, and so on. And we'll see it's survived to this point, which means it's a very powerful structural arch. But at some point, there is a burden that becomes too big even for it. And that's what worries me. So that's sort of the first point. The second point is, I don't know if that's correct, that there is Americans now want to all govern each other's lives. I think you have to say that the electorate has changed. When the electorate in the 18th century was property owners, and male property owners at that, right? There were no racial qualifications. That came much later. But as a practical matter, there were very few African-American landowners of any significance outside of the Northeast at the time, right? I'm talking about 1780, right? 10% of Boston at the time was African-American, mostly free black, right? Although Boston had slaves in those years. People forget that. When the electorate was mostly property owners, it had to, people were forced to take a look at long-term interests because they would be affected by things in the long term. And they also wanted the national government to be small and well-defined because they wanted something closer to home where they could have a direct say in exactly where the highway went or what was taught at the local school.
Mm-hmm.
As the electorate changes and renters start voting, women start voting, people on public benefit start voting. I mean, right? There many states in the 19th century did not allow you to vote if you were getting welfare, their equivalent of welfare checks, that, or serve on juries for that matter, certainly in criminal cases. That all changes in the 20th century, in the beginning of the progressive era. So you have different people, different kinds of people in different situations of life now deciding what government can and can't do. And those people have very different interests. They're not property owners with a long-term outlook. Many of them are people who need a problem solved today, and they expect the government to do it. So government has gone from a distant father to a breastfeeding mother. And that is a profound transition. And we also have to look at how the role of institutions have changed to accommodate this change, right? So, for example, the people who most reliably vote for the Democratic Party, for example, are overwhelmingly dependent upon the federal government. And they do not want to see those payments stop or be reduced. And there is no argument about the national debt or the Constitution or the role of government that will persuade them that they should stop receiving, electronic payments into their bank account.
This is a statement you made. Let me tell you, as I was interrupting, that I have to disagree with you that it's unique to Democrats. Okay, and I want to make one. One is you just saw
I didn't say it was unique. I said the people who vote overwhelmingly take this point.
But I think this is true of people overwhelmingly vote Democrat or Republican, that they all want government subsidies. Okay.
Oh, well, that's a different thing. Yes.
Farmers want government assistance, right? They want government assistance. Every major business goes to Washington asking for tax preferences, right? So they want regulatory benefits, they want tax preferences, so every business is lobbying for some sort of subsidy, some sort of protection, right? Tariffs. Protect
the
my
difference is that most farmers,
Social Security. If you take a look at the average income of now a Trump voter, okay, so most of them, when they're contributing to Social Security with their average income, median incomes, okay, they're hugely subsidized by Social Security. Okay, so they want a subsidy, they want a state to save for them, and if the amount of money that they put in, many of them are under the assumption that the benefits they're receiving they paid for, as if if you take a look at their how much money they contributed, the interest earned on what they contributed in the balance of the account today, they actually think that they're basically self-funded their own payments, which is just false. If not, the system wouldn't be as bankrupt, as it is. So the same with Medicare, and if you take a look at what causes the biggest aspects of our fiscal deficit, are benefits to the middle class, not to the poor, to the middle class. Okay, they're the ones who receive more benefits than the poor. Then we have to think about what's the with the announcement today that they're going to keep the guarantees in Freddie and Fannie and take them public. Why do we need Freddie and Fannie? Why do we need the government subsidizing people's mortgages? Why those agencies that went bankrupt, subsidizing people's mortgages. People should rely on developing enough credit scores themselves to qualify for a mortgage. Get the income, and if we had sound money, we wouldn't have these crazy prices in housing. We have the crazy pricing in housing because we have unsound money. So we print too much money, and that causes house prices to go up. So there should be a greater demand for sound money, that causes the government to have to respond to give all these subsidies out. So everybody wants help from the government. Everybody. I don't care how much money you have. And nobody wants to be accountable in the most important way of being accountable. Okay, which is they want to borrow money, and they want other people responsible who are not born yet to suffer the consequences of their fiscal irresponsibility. So our whole generation is immoral, not just other people. Everyone wants to live off government. Everyone wants to live with benefit of government, and everyone wants to transfer the obligation of paying that back to a generation that has no voice yet. In the past, we called that taxation without representation, and it helped promote the resolution. So, and we are the first generation in the history that has not tried to pay down a debt, but increase the debt, and we're going to hand that debt off. So that's why I always find it amusing when I see people, my generation. I'm going to be 70, in January, and I guess I'm a boomer. I guess, and the boomers like to make fun of how Gen Z and other generation, are irresponsible. No, we're the most irresponsible generation. Okay, we're giving Gen Z, $37 trillion of fiscal deficits and over $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities. How could you be any more irresponsible than that? How can you be any less accountable than that?
Exactly. Well, here's the thing, Jeff. I mean, the baby boom generation deserves a lot of abuse, right? Because it sits in the middle, right? Remember, you're talking about the future generation that's yet to be born that can't speak. But there's also a generation that has died that also can't speak. And those are the people who sacrificed and built this country, the United States, into what it is. These were the people who sacrificed their sons and sometimes daughters to war, who built great industries, who invented great cures, who did daring explorations to the North Pole and to the moon, right? And on the back of that complete legacy, the baby boom generation decides to spend it on social programs and various self-indulgent causes, right? Which of course have some benefits, right? I mean, We did accomplish many things on the environmental front and on the racial justice front, but nonetheless, and they have ruled over our politics since their very young years in political life in the 1960s, up until a minute ago. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats running the House until the change in power were all baby boomers. Biden is and I think Trump is pre-baby boom, but the one level down from them in the White House, where it was a baby boom generation. So this generation has exerted its will over American political life for half a century, right? If we, it is like what the PRI, I think it is called, party in Mexico did, ruling for half a century. And whatever the benefits that they brought initially, the creativity and the energy declines the longer they're in power, right? And people, once they get into power, cease to have new and responsive ideas. And for the dead hand of a generation over American life and over the lives of much of the industrialized world, that generation is now finally fading. And I think there's going to be a very painful readjustment in a whole bunch of areas: economic, cultural, and political. And in all of these fights we're seeing in Australia, Canada, Western Europe, and the United States, we're really seeing what happens when a new generation takes over and has to look at the results of everything that a generation that's been in power for so long and reassess everything. And sometimes it means in the renovation, you have to take it down to the studs and rebuild because you've got mold, right? And sometimes it means that there are some useful things that we should preserve, but it's going to be a harsh reassessment. And when you see online so many people saying, oh, we can't, you're a radical, you're a dangerous revolutionary, you can't dare change anything. These are people trying to hold on to a baby boom consensus that has really ceased to add anything meaningful and helpful in decades. And they should, frankly, just be ignored. It's time for a fresh look at everything. And I'm by everything, I mean the way business works, the way Hollywood works, the way government works, the way other parts of culture work, to take a fresh look and reconnect it to the reality of a very changed society. This is, when you listen to Democrats talk to the African-American community, it makes me think that they think it's still 1965. And when we listen to environmentalists talk to industry, they act like it's still 1971, right? Their hearts are so locked in a past, which is so different from the present day, right? We actually have problems they can't see, and we've addressed. You never solve problems, you address them. We've addressed the problems they're complaining about have largely been addressed, right? And there's enormous numbers of problems that have emerged that they're not willing to deal with. And so what they're saying is a massive political change and radicalism. It's really just a generational change and people taking a fresh look, and why that baby boom hung on for so many decades rather than turning things over to younger generations.
When you talk about the environmental issues and you talk about those other issues, yes, it's true, they're part of the culture war, but it's still not confronting our fiscal crisis. Our fiscal crisis is our defense spending, is the non-discretionary spending, and the only conversation we're having in DC is marginal cuts to discretionary spending, and the structural deficits. You could cut discretionary spending to zero, and we'd be still running deficits. So,
well, it doesn't mean we shouldn't cut discretionary
nobody's proposing.
spending.
We have to deal with we have to deal with the non-discretionary spending and acknowledge, that we created false expectations for people that we can't live up to. That's that. So yes, it's nice to talk about, yes, environmental issues, terrible issues to talk about. That was yesterday's struggle, civil rights, yesterday's struggle. But that's not the reason. That's not the reason we're in $37 trillion of debt. It isn't. Okay, it's not the reason we have $200 trillion of unfunded liabilities. This is the thing is we keep avoiding to have the most difficult conversation precisely because it's difficult. Okay, precisely because of the fact because precisely the fact that both parties. This is why I say everybody's accountable. Both parties have sold the free lunch to the American people. Okay, both parties. Okay,
If you run
we're a free lunch society, and almost every voter is voting for their free lunch. Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, two things. One is if you run the Weimar playbook, you get the Weimar results. And that's dangerous hyperinflation, collapse of society type stuff, right? But I don't think we'll ever get to address those issues until there's a crisis that no one can ignore. And for now, lots of people are not feeling the crisis.
Well, so so my point, that's the whole generation is unaccountable.
But
that's what I disagree.
Yeah, the whole generation. Yeah, sure.
I can understand on a personal level. There are people who go out, they get a job, they work, they're accountable to a boss or to some other people. They make a living. But to the extent that nobody is benefiting from government subsidies, yeah, everybody is lobbying for government subsidies.
But Jeff,
everybody wants Wall Street got bailouts. Okay, how wealthy are the people on Wall Street? You think we've given more money to the poor people than we gave to Wall Street? No, we gave a lot more money to Wall Street than we gave. Think about Wall Street, the bank bailouts. Okay, we had the thrift crisis, the savings loan crisis of the 1980s. Cost us almost 10% of GDP. Okay, in bailouts. And then then we rescued the whole Wall Street industry by converting them all into bank holding companies so they could all borrow money from the Fed at no interest rate, because if they had to go to the marketplace, why shouldn't everyone in society have the same ability as Wall Street does? Okay, they're the wealthiest. They got bonuses. Okay, so how accountable are they?
Not very. Look, I think
it's nice to say I want to pose a hard budget constraint on other people, when I don't want a hard budget constraint imposed on me. Okay.
Right. But capitalism is not just about the freedom to succeed. It has to be about the freedom to fail. And that means those who make bad decisions, even on Wall Street, should suffer the consequences of those, as not just to educate themselves, but to educate their competitors and society as a whole. And so when we insulate people from that accountability, what we're doing is slowing down the learning. And learning is what leads to productivity growth, and productivity growth is what leads to prosperity. It's just that simple.
Wasn't there bipartisan support for that?
I doubt it. I mean, look.
For bailing out Wall Street, there were bipartisan support.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I talked to the bureaucrat at Treasury years ago who's designing the program, and I asked him, how did you pick $750 billion for the initial bailout? And he said, well, Congress would never give us $1 trillion, and $500 billion seemed too little, so we split the difference. Think about that, right? I mean, it wasn't a mathematical formula. It wasn't a careful analysis. It was just what we could get away with, right? I was against the Wall Street bailouts for obvious reasons. I think accountability is important. The freedom to fail is important. And we got to also police the words we use. There's no such thing as discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. If anyone who's ever been broke knows perfectly well that everything becomes discretionary. Everything, when it's time to cut, when you only have so much money coming in, maybe you have to leave the fancy house and move down, and rent an apartment in an unflattering part of town. Maybe you have to stop leasing the car and go buy a jalopy. Maybe you're eating less filet mignon, right? Everything that was once seemed non-discretionary, that's absolutely essential, suddenly gets looked at closely. Now, I know what you're saying. You can get rid of all the so-called discretionary spending and it wouldn't solve the problem, but you need momentum. The public needs to see that you can make some cuts and stick to it before they're going to trust you touching the major social welfare programs. And I think America could live without the Urban Mass Transit Administration. I think it could live without the Appalachian Regional Commission, or whatever it's called, right? I think we could get rid of some of these things, pocket some small savings, but create some momentum for a larger conversation about cuts. But if we don't cut anything because we can't cut everything, we're worse off.
No, I think if we create the expectations that these cuts will create fiscal solvency, that the problem is that then that's not building credibility. When you say let me accomplish this and we'll solve all our problems, as opposed to we're beginning to solve our problems. Okay, we're being told that do this and they'll solve all our problems. Not that it's a first step in solving a much bigger problem. Right now what we're being told by everyone is Social Security Social Security will be viable forever and by doing nothing. Okay, which is not true. Every year the administrator of the trust fund issues a report, and describes the fiscal circumstances of Social Security, and what's the response is to say, let's do nothing. And every year we don't do anything, the bigger that problem grows. Okay, so the question is we keep by doing nothing. There are certain problems we do nothing. We don't necessarily make things grow much worse in the future. And certain things we do nothing, our obligations are compounding and they become much worse in the future. So the question is what we prioritize. If we prioritize stuff that if we ignore today will have really no consequence on the future if we handle it later. But then we're not doing the things that'll have a higher opportunity cost. This is my problem. An educated society should understand the concept of opportunity cost, and we should make decisions based upon opportunity costs. So what we should focus on today are the problems that have the highest opportunity costs, of not solving, and we should ignore the problems that have the lowest opportunity cost of not solving if we want to start building momentum. But we're not building momentum if we're solving a few things, but the ultimate problem keeps growing because what we're ignoring is compounding. So what we save from what we cut is more than offset by the compounding of what we're ignoring. So you could do some cuts today in those small programs. Meanwhile, the problem in Social Security and Medicare keep compounding, and so you're overall not making anything better.
Well, you could lower the cost of Social Security by at least 30% simply by getting rid by modernizing the payment system and the bureaucracy at Social Security itself, right?
No, that's false. That's false.
The cost, by the way, it's in many cases it's still mailing out paper checks and printing those checks and paying for postage on those checks. The number of employees who process payments, the number of employees who
the operating costs of Social Security are not 30% of the disbursements. They aren't. So that's just false. I understand. I heard.
No, I'm saying the operating costs as they are today could be reduced by 30% from where they are today, based on.
But the operating costs as a percentage of the unfunded liabilities are statistically insignificant. Okay.
I don't know.
The unfunded liability in Social Security is over $100 trillion. Okay.
Yes.
We're not spending $1 trillion on the infrastructure of Social Security.
No, but we are spending billions.
We're not spending nowhere near that is the cost of administering Social Security. Nowhere near that is the cost of administering Social Security. We're not even spending a few $100 million administering Social Security. So
I believe it's more, but I'm not going to argue accountancy with you. But I'm going to say there is savings to be gotten in the administration of these programs and in getting rid of people who've defrauded the system.
Those savings are going to come nowhere close to solving the problem. This is the problem. If you sell something that's not a solution and selling it as a solution, we got to confront the problem.
Hold on, Jeff. Let's live in the real world for a second. Solving the current deficit, the debt, not the deficit, the debt problem is going to take a generation of determined effort. It's not going to be done in one.
We don't have a generation because we'll be bankrupt before a generation.
Well,
it's not going to. We don't have a generation. The belief that we have a generation, is I think a very flawed belief. We don't have a generation to solve the problem. We'll be insolvent way before that.
As insolvency becomes nearer, the politicians will start to move. But the Cassandras have been warning us about Social Security ever since Reagan convened the Social Security Commission in 1983, right? And there is just no political appetite. And the reason for that is pretty clear. Half of the baby boom, according to a recent Arthur Andersen survey, half has about $500 in emergency savings. Think about that. A lifetime of working and earning, and they have set aside less than 500. They've set aside on average.
That doesn't seem to be an account. That's my point. My point is a comment that you made about accountability. Those are people unaccountable. Those are people. So even the people who work decided that they prefer to consume rather than defer consumption to save, so they had adequate savings for their retirement. Instead, they expect another generation to subsidize their retirement. That doesn't seem.
I mean, you've seen the classic math, right?
You're not accountable if you expect other people to fund your health care and to fund your savings. That's not a sense of accountability. And our society today is pretty universal in the support is that they want other people to fund, and they didn't save. They prefer to spend and live the high life, go into debt, living beyond their means, and then leaving the problem, leaving the bill to another generation. That's what I'm trying to get is it was your statement that anybody's accountable. I think the level of people who have any real sense of accountability, is just a handful of people. At least I tried to do my part. Okay, I contributed to the system, but I don't claim any Social Security benefits. So I'm not taking any money out of the system. Fortunately, I've had a pretty decent career. And I don't want to. I could sit back and say, and really, I'm entitled to my fucking money in there. Okay, but I'm not. So because I want to contribute to my country. So most of the people, my friends, who have been pretty successful lives, they all tell me I'm stupid, that I put the money in and I should take it out, and maybe I am stupid for doing it. And I know at the end of the day, it's not consequential to solving the problem. The fact that, I'm not taking the money out, and I am entitled to take the money out because I put it in, it's my money and I should take it out, but I'm not. So, because I care for things more than just myself. So, so it's just given the fact that I don't need it, I can't assign it to somebody else. I'd be happy to assign it to somebody else if I had the right to. I'd be happy to say, this is my money, I saved it. Don't give it to me, give it to somebody else. I'd be happy to do it. Even a non-family member, I tell me somebody who needs money, and and I'll do that. But you can't do that. So I just said, okay, I'm not going to apply for any of my benefits. So that's a choice, that I made because I like to consider myself an accountable person. So, but that's why I say I don't want. The part that I really did not like most of what you said is basically saying Democratic Party are made up of people who are unaccountable, who the people who vote for them tend to be people who don't have a high level of accountability, and that the people who vote Republican have a high level of accountability.
No. I wasn't making a partisan point at all.
I think Americans are unaccountable, and Americans don't want any accountability. If the Americans wanted accountability, we would not have a $37 trillion deficit, because anyone who has a sense of accountability knows that's wrong. Okay. Anyone, they just know it's wrong. So, the question is, how can we build a sense of accountability? I don't think we're going to build a sense of accountability by telling people, let's cut a few dollars here. And because we showed we can cut a few savings, now we'll be able to tackle the big problem of the fact that, and Reagan, mentioning Reagan did do something about it. Reagan did not ignore the problem.
No, he did something.
Reagan did something about it. Reagan increased the percentage that people had to contribute to Social Security, and he raised the ceiling on how much, so there was a double tax on Social Security during the Reagan administration, and Reagan saved Social Security.
Absolutely. But he also warned about the long-term.
He saved.
Didn't deal with.
Excuse me?
He also warned repeatedly about the long-term problem, which Congress did nothing to deal with.
Well, not only Congress, the executive, but nobody's done anything about it.
Right, exactly. Congress has the power, not no one else.
We keep being told by everybody that nothing needs to be done about it. We can't raise the retirement age. We can't means test it. We can't do any. We can't come up with any. You can't even talk about it. So,
first of all, both of those things will happen sooner rather than later, right? You'll see a higher retirement age I mean, Denmark just did it, raised the retirement age to 67 in that country. Sweden is considering a similar move. Those ideas will come west. We'll end up doing. We'll raise.
You know what? You know what's going to likely happen is that the younger generation are now going to have to pay more into the system to fund the boomers who describe the younger generation as irresponsible.
Right, of course. Yes, that'll happen. But let me just be a little more clear of what I mean by the accountable and the unaccountable classes. Okay. By accountable, I'm not describing a political party. I'm not describing an income or an education level.
Yeah, I understand that.
All right. So the accountable people are those whose pay is directly tied to results. It could be a commission on selling real estate or shoes or cars. It can be that their annual salary is nominal and they make most of their money from a performance-related bonus.
Right.
Most business owners, especially small business owners, are highly accountable, right? They are directly affected by the decisions they make. Their income is tied to results, right?
Well, almost all these people we say are accountable, when they go bankrupt, they want subsidies. They're accountable for keeping their profit. They want to privatize the profits and socialize the losses. So almost all people when they go bankrupt want to socialize their losses. What they want to keep is the profits. So if they were really accountable, they would not want to socialize people. They would not want to socialize the losses.
Their businesses
to socialize losses is not accountable for the losses.
Their businesses may go bankrupt, but I think if you looked at the bankruptcy data, you would discover that very few of them are consumer bankruptcies, right? As members of the accountable class. Now let's look at the unaccountable, which is a far larger and more influential class, right? That's the majority of the civil service, right? There's no tie between pay and results in the civil service. Among the tenured professors, there is no tie, right? They can teach 10 courses or one course. So, as long as they do the minimum required by the department, their pay is the same or goes up with inflation-adjusted increases. I would say the grad students, the temporary teachers, the contract professors, they're much more tied to results. But again, neither one of them is tied to end results. That is to say, the student knew X amount and after the course knows Y amount, and you're paid on the difference. There's almost no arrangements like that. Retirees, students, people on public benefit, the payments they receive are not tied to performance.
Well,
right?
I think one is,
I'm not talking about whether they're morally accountable, politically accountable. I'm just saying, is their pay tied to results, or is their payment not tied to results?
For many professors, like take, for example, accounting professors or finance professors or things like that, the universities have to pay them for their opportunity cost. So if I'm a finance professor and I can get a job on Wall Street, the university has to say, I have a superstar professor. Do I pay them what Wall Street? Would I pay them what they could get elsewhere, or do I lose them? Okay. So that's a sense of an accountability to the marketplace. The marketplace is setting their wages. So there is a level of accountability because the marketplace is setting their wages. What's their accountability? If I lose the superstar professor, maybe students will not come to study here anymore. Maybe my revenues in the institution will come down. So normally what do presses do to have accountability? They go out and they get grants for their research. They do research that people find valuable research, and if they do that, they attract students. And if they don't do that, they get fired. Then they don't get tenured. So up until the point of, for somebody to get, we can talk about the tenure system and whether that's a good way to manage universities or not. I would say they're pretty accountable because people all over the world want to come to study in the United States at university level because we have the best universities in the world. We have the best research universities in the world. And that's why everyone in the world wants to come here. So from that sense, and if we paid them differently, what they'd be? They wouldn't be teaching. They'd all be in a Wall Street firm or somewhere else, or in a biotech firm or some other job. So right now, if you're a highly educated person, really, really smart, okay, have a lot of wisdom and could be a great mentor to somebody, to pay that person to stay at the university and not go to the private sector costs a lot of money because there's so many private sector opportunities out there, and you have to compete with the private sector. So, maybe for other professions, it's not so, but there's a reason why some professors make a lot of money. They make a lot of money because that's the price of keeping them at the university rather than having a brain drain all go to the private school. And that's what that's what has the attraction of all the international students coming to study in the U.S. We have the best research universities in the world. Okay, by far.
I don't think that the foreign students are actually coming to the United States because of the quality of the research. I think they're coming for the same reason American students go to university for the most part, which is to network with each other and make valuable professional contacts. They are going to get advanced degrees for the same reason that people go to cocktail parties, to meet valuable friends and potential marriage partners. Let's just be much more honest about this. Most of these people are not true scholars who are coming to just study some ancient manuscripts or to get deep into economic data and really make an original intellectual contribution. They're coming because America continues to dominate the world economy, and they want their connections and places in it. And that's true for American citizens as well as foreign students, right? It's just a fact. So the quality of the research is really beside the point. They're coming because of the quality of the classmates.
The best students want to be taught by the best teachers.
Yes,
so,
but that's 5%.
And if we have lousy teachers, but that's the economics of the accountability of professors to the marketplace. Do you want every smart professor to go be in the private sector and just have idiots at universities teaching?
I think that's a false choice, and you know it. Look, the thing is,
but you're saying.
Hold on. Just think about it for a minute. Wouldn't you rather have the same foreign students go work at a startup or at a bank in the private sector and really learn about American life in a balanced way and make a real contribution through the workplace, rather than go to study at some place like Harvard, where they're going to get a distorted view of America, a distorted view of what makes our institutions unique, and are not going to contribute anything of value except to the purse of Harvard itself?
Well, people go to Harvard because Harvard graduates make a lot of money getting out of Harvard because the marketplace values Harvard. Okay.
No, yes.
I guess if you want to substitute your perception of what's good for America than the marketplace's perception of what's good for America. Right now the marketplace is saying we like Harvard graduates, and that's why people go to Harvard, is because they like Harvard graduates. So is every Harvard graduate a clone of what they're getting in the classroom, and they just parrot what their teachers tell them? And that's it? No, that's not the case. So
look, Harvard is a very interesting place, and I'm always happy to visit and have conversations there. I'm not running down Harvard. What I am saying is, if we decreased the number of foreign student visas and we increased the number of visas for people to come and work inside our great companies, we would benefit immediately from an increase in productivity and new ideas. And the coming to work would also benefit intellectually.
The government should set quotas on this stuff. You don't want it worked out by the private sector. You want the government to work this out.
No, I think that the higher education lobby is very powerful and has lobbied for more visas. And Silicon Valley is not as powerful, and they have not even been able to win the H-1B fight. And I think that's out of balance. But if we made it as easy to get,
what's the harm? Do you think that somebody comes to get a, I can tell you, like when I studied, in many PhD classes, in economics, it's not like they're taking the places away from Americans in these classes. It's the fact is these groups are very small, and more than half are foreigners, because the Americans, because the rate of foreigners' interest in having a PhD in economics is more than the rate of Americans wanting a PhD in economics.
Right. We also have a crisis teaching.
There's a very simple thing we could do. For many economic programs, that the top schools, I think they would not be financially viable without foreign students. So
maybe that's the case, but here's the thing: like if you made it wide open on if you want to work in the American economy, you can have a visa to come here. I mean, I would actually take the number of H-1Bs up to several million a year, or maybe make it open-ended. If you can come here and work as an engineer or as a scientist or as a business executive and earn your keep and not get on social benefit and read and write English at a level to function in an American workplace, then let's let the market decide how many of them choose to go to graduate school in the United States rather than go and work and get paid and learn in America while you're getting paid. I think if you want to let the market decide, get the government out of the way and let the best engineers of the world come and work in the United States and invent things and learn and teach.
Do you think America benefited by the fact that so many Mexicans went to the United States, got a PhD in economics, and it was those generation that got PhDs in political science and economics and came back here and convinced the country that they should abolish socialism and embrace capitalism? Do you think that's beneficial for the U.S., that Mexico is now a much wealthier country now than it used to be?
Of course it is.
Okay, well, that's a product of foreigners going to the United States and getting an education in the United States.
I'm not saying we should stop foreign students.
Was that bad for the country?
Jeff, you're not actually hearing me. What I'm saying is, let's create a marketplace, right? Let's let people, if they can more entally, we got to get rid of the restrictions that stop highly educated, highly productive people from working in our country. Let's open that up. Let's let engineers and scientists and extraordinary executives come and work freely here, right? We keep the number of foreign student visas the same. We could even increase it. Who cares? But the point is, if talented people have a choice rather than being directed into one channel by the higher education lobby, we'll let the market decide. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't disagree with you that I would welcome anyone who had a graduate degree here, and didn't commit a crime. I'd be happy to give them a visa to stay and work. But even if they don't stay and work, if they go to their home country and they promote the values that made America great inside their own country, it would seem to me that makes us better off as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think what we're really trying to work around is
if you have countries that have all these that still believe in socialism, and a whole bunch of people come over and they get exposed to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and capitalism and freedom and political science and proper governance structures, and then they go back and they start influencing their own country to embrace more of this type of openness. Haven't we benefited from that?
Yes, but is the benefit but as in anything, you got to weigh benefits and costs. There's a more effective way to get there. They would learn about all those things, the Constitution, free speech, free enterprise, working in America, as well as studying in America. And I'm saying, let's remove the barriers to the most productive people in the world coming to our country to work. Now, I'm not saying people who are illiterate in their native language, let alone English, should be admitted to the United States without limit. That's insane. But for highly educated, productive people, who want to come here and add value and get paid in a market-based basis for that, I think we should open it up for them. That's what I'm saying.
I agree with. Let them choose.
Let them choose. Let's have a marketplace.
Their own human capital. Let them choose. Let them choose how they allocate their own human capital. But it seems to me we want to try and attract the best capital, independent of where those people were born. It seems to me we're better off by having the best stock of human capital, independent of where that human capital was born. So we want to keep, as you seem to be saying, is that the best human capital, we want to give them an option that's easy to exercise to stay and work in the United States,
or come to bypass the higher education monopoly and come and work and learn and teach, because as you learn things, you pass them on to others who don't know them, and therefore you're also teaching, right? And the best companies are learning companies that are constantly optimizing and taking in new ideas and new market realities and adjusting. And that process, that market process, is extremely transformational. And when people absorb it and then they go back home and change their societies, that's great. But if they stay here and transform ours, that's great too. The point is, we have made it very easy to become a foreign student. We've made it much harder to be a foreign entrepreneur, and that seems unbalanced and wrong to me.
No, I agree with you. So on that point, I struggle with. But the point was, how we got started this conversation was the concept of the fact is that teachers, I think teachers have an accountability, because in many of the professions, that where the teachers get paid the highest, they get paid the highest precisely because that's what you need to pay them to stay at the institution. So there is an accountability of the institution. It's not like there's no accountability. The university says, I either pay the teacher that amount or they leave. So
well, that's true of the professional schools, the law schools, the medical schools, and so on. Undergraduate, it's much harder to measure. And I can tell you, if you look at the public high schools in the United States used to have entrance exams, right? Yes, it's a public school, but to get into any, you needed to pass an entrance exam. So if you look at the entrance exams for New York City public schools in 1910, and you ask college graduates today if they can pass those tests, they can't. So clearly the standard of education has fallen, right? And that what we're doing by bringing in foreign students is making up for a failed K through 12 program. We're not teaching math effectively. We're not teaching English literature effectively. We're not teaching grammar, writing.
That's why the foreigners are not coming here to go to high school. The foreigners are coming here to go to college. They're mostly to graduate school. So they're coming mostly to go to graduate school. And why do they come mostly to come to graduate school? Because we have the best graduate programs. Part of it, I agree with you, is networking. But the people with that income bracket that are coming here, they don't need to worry about networking. So, most of the people that will come from these foreign countries are already well networked in their own country, and
they're not networked here. And that's the arbitrage.
But we're trying to network there. We're knocking on their doors looking to meet them. So, because typically they have privileged access in the countries there are. So someone will always be knocking on the door who wants to do business in their countries, because unfortunately that's how you have to do business, in many parts of the world. Is knowing most of the world is a know-who economy, not a know-how economy. So the United States used to be a know-how economy. It's becoming more know-who than know-how, but it used to be basically a know-how economy. Now it's probably too much know-who than know-how. So, but it's still to a greater extent than most countries, it's still a know-how economy relative to most other countries.
But know-who is always a sign of a declining economy, not a growing one.
Yes. So, so that, I was just nitpicking on that point, because I do think that college professors, that have an opportunity cost, and universities have to pay them, or they leave. So that's a market test, so your market test is, I pay you this amount, and a certain amount, I don't get to keep good people. If I don't get the good people, then how much because whatever they're paying people right now to stay there and teach, they're making a profit on that, through what people are willing to pay just to get into that university and pay for it. So that's ultimately the market test, is that everyone gets a right to determine who they want to apply to, and the top schools have an abundance of applications of reasonably qualified people to get in, so that they can run, a financially, solvent, university. And, and then the other universities, they need more help, which is why we got, state.
The problem though is, Jeff, is these universities are not solvent, right? They are borrowing. The ones that have large endowments are borrowing from that endowment at relatively high interest rates. Even Harvard itself, people talk about its $53 billion endowment. Most of that is illiquid in real estate and private equity and so on. But the part that is liquid is liquefied mainly by borrowing against those assets. And that same is true at Columbia and other elite schools. So they've created little Weimars. They are borrowing more than they're making. Their endowments, which were gifts from earlier generations or earlier graduates of the current generation, are not keeping pace with their spending ambitions. They're heavily dependent on federal loans and federal grants. they are not solvent, well-managed institutions.
No institution is well managed if it gets a lot of federal money. Okay,
Correct.
so but the problem
Maybe SpaceX. Maybe SpaceX.
right now, nobody who gets government money is efficient, and because if they were really efficient, they wouldn't need government money. So Musk himself has acknowledged that without the government support, he probably would have gone bankrupt. Okay, so but the money he got, but the people, the government, the taxpayers who helped fund Musk, what kind of return did they get from have him being the wealthiest guy in the world to a guy, if he didn't get the money from the government, would be unknown today because he would have gone into bankruptcy.
I'll tell you what they got. The payload cost of putting a pound in orbit under SpaceX has dropped from more than $3,000 a pound to $4 a pound, right? The latest projections. So that's an enormous benefit. That changes the cost of putting things in orbit, which also means it changes the ability to move things from one part of the earth to another.
I'm not paying. I don't want to pay taxes for the government to allocate who deserves subsidies and who doesn't deserve subsidies. And if they're successful, I'm supposed to enjoy the success that has made them rich. Where I want money in my pocket. Okay, that's what I want. If my money has been taken out to give to somebody else who's then made a lot of money off my money, I want my piece of the action. That's not unreasonable.
It's not unreasonable at all. It's how capitalism works, Jeff.
Yes. So it's not capitalism to give somebody free money that if it goes bad, you didn't know it would be successful or not. And the government is not the best venture capital investor. Okay.
Oh no, it's often the worst possible
venture capital investor. So the government seeds a whole bunch of projects. Here we cite one of the failures, but we never talk about one of the successes, but we never talk about all the failures. We only point out the success and not the thousands of failures. We talk about the success and when there is that success, the benefit of that success is privatized. Okay, so the fact that we can do this doesn't make my life any better. Okay, might make somebody's life better, but they should pay for it. I don't want to pay for it because I don't.
Hold on, Jeff. We're rapidly moving toward a world in which you can have point-to-point rocket trips from, say, New York to Tokyo, and reducing the time from many hours to 45 minutes would be an enormous economic boost, right? And if you believe their projections for what the new rockets can do, it can move 200 tons of cargo in that lift.
So you're saying the only way of accomplishing that was to give free money?
I'm not saying
it couldn't have been accomplished. Without free money, it couldn't have been accomplished. Okay, you couldn't have cut a deal that says, "Here's money, and if you're really successful, you're going to give warrants to everyone." That deal could not have been cut.
Well, I don't know if that's a counterfactual. I mean, I don't know if it could have been done or not, right?
Of course it could have been done. Of course it could have been done. If my choice is going bankrupt or giving or taking money where I'm giving warrants and I dilute myself in success, what do you think a rational business person is going to do?
Well, it might well be that somebody who was investing in rocketry in the early 2000s would say, there's no chance this is ever going to work. It's never worked before. I'm not investing.
Again, if your point is that somebody needed to invest because they couldn't convince the marketplace to invest, and that there's this great social benefit if it succeeds, so because there's social benefits, the government should invest. I'm not talking about.
I'm not arguing that. I'm against
what terms and conditions for somebody that can't get any money anywhere else in the marketplace. Why would they turn down a deal better than a low-cost debt with an equity kicker? If they have no other choice, their decision is saying, I don't want to do my project, because you're
I think you're looking at it backwards. You're saying, why wouldn't he take the deal? No, I'm saying, what if the money is just simply not offered? What if everyone's saying, I'm not going to invest on any terms? There's the problem, right? But look, SpaceX, Tesla, Elon's companies in general are an exception. Any other government-funded business that I've ever seen fails massively, right? So
without that government money, nobody would be talking about Elon Musk today because he wouldn't be the wealthiest guy in the world because those would have failed.
Yes,
Okay, that's my
most
point.
likely. I mean,
And
I don't have a crystal ball, but
he,
yeah, sure.
he said that. He said that himself.
Right.
Okay.
Well, maybe
So
he's
he
right.
said that
We
himself.
have no way of knowing for
So all
certain.
I'm saying is the government did a stupid deal by not looking to get equity kickers in all these deals. Okay, that's all I'm saying. The government was stupid. It didn't that Musk would have taken the money if his choice was, I need this money because I'm going to fail, and the government said, we'll give you this money, but we want an equity kicker in addition to this. He would not have said no. But we
Oh, he
didn't
would have
ask
happily
him.
said yes.
Yes.
The political class that gave him the money assumed he was going to be like everyone else and just frittered away. Right? They wouldn't have asked for an equity kicker because, first of all, they don't have the imagination. But second of all, they assumed the equity would be worthless because they assumed, just like Solyndra and all the Syn Fuels Corporation and these things all fail. Right? The political class gave him the money not because they thought he would succeed, but because they thought he would fail, but they would look good for trying.
Yes.
This is virtue signaling, right?
Yes.
That's what this is. He got the money, they didn't think he was going to succeed. They thought, in fact, it was probably impossible.
Right. It was a great thing to talk about. I agree with you. Virtue signaling. It's a great, look what I'm funding. I'm funding these streams. Okay. So, right. but I assume if somebody's going to take my money as a fiduciary, okay, that they should have fiduciary responsibility to do a job what a fiduciary should be doing. And I think the government failed in its fiduciary responsibility. So that's
I agree. I mean, the self-funders and government funders both make the same mistake because they escape outside accountability and they tend to engage in a lot of indulgent spending that doesn't yield results, right? And that's true of the government, and it's true of the person who's got a very large budget and is building their dream house, right? They both build things that will not be rewarded by the market in terms of resale value, right? The people who seem best at value creation are those who have outside investors who govern their behavior and sharpen their decisions. Musk is an outlier. He's so intent on what he's doing. I don't think we should expect that the next 2,000 government investments will do 1/10 as well. The government got lucky here, and it wasn't even trying to succeed, right? I don't think it's a model, right? I think the more important model to remember is the Wright brothers versus the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian administration the Smithsonian Institution got a very large grant from the U.S. Congress to invent heavier than air flight in, I think, 1902, 1901. Meanwhile, the Wright brothers received no government funding. They got their funding from a bicycle shop that they operated part-time in Ohio. They chose Kitty Hawk because it was out of the way and they could test their flying machine without getting any complaints from neighbors. And the Wright brothers succeeded. And to great fanfare, several weeks before the Wright brothers did their first successful flight at Kitty Hawk, the Smithsonian called together the great and the good. They had all the great scientists helping them at the time, people from France, Germany as well. And the plane went to take off a ramp and sank into the Potomac River, never flew an inch. 3 weeks later, or several weeks later, we had the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. So I think that's a better model. The private sector is smarter about its resources, smarter about innovations, because it's not trying to satisfy a political class which has lots of different interests. It is hugely focused on doing one thing, and focus produces outsized performance. Just like Olympic athletes who focus and hone down onto one thing to make their performance truly excellent, the same is true in business. The government, that kind of focus simply is impossible.
And I don't know whether
we're not for very long anyway. I mean, we have the Manhattan Project, the moon shot, the moon landing, but it's not sustainable over many, many years because the government is subject to so many forces.
What we don't know, okay, because we haven't had an opportunity of having this counterfactual, is if Musk didn't receive those government subsidies, okay, and he was about to fail and he couldn't raise capital, he might not have been able to raise capital to continue on his own venture, but you don't know whether somebody else would have come in and funded him, where he would have been an employee, not an owner, but given him enough incentive to say, we're going to fund this deal, but you don't have absolute control. I mean, maybe he wouldn't have wanted that. Maybe he wouldn't. We don't know, because at that point in time, he doesn't have the money he had today. So the calculus he would have done at that point in time. So we don't know if in the absence of a government.
Knowing what you know about Elon, is there a world in which he would agree to be an employee, just an employee? I don't see it.
Well, if you go into bankruptcy, you can decide not to be but somebody, if they value those assets, might buy those assets up if he would have gone into bankruptcy. And they might have deployed those assets successfully. We don't know. So to sit back and say, if Musk didn't do this, we might never have had this. We don't really know that that's
Jeff,
true.
Musk was the asset. That's what his brain, his desire, the many failed attempts. I mean, when they launched the first 3 rockets blew up. If the 4th rocket did not succeed, he would have lost his contract and he would have been bankrupt. And he's sitting in a small trailer in a Los Angeles parking lot, watching this computer screen showing the launch at Kwajalein 8,000 miles or some odd miles away, hoping that this rocket is going to climb into the sky and save his business. That kind of vision, that kind of fortitude, that kind of constant innovation, there's not many people in the world who have that. And of the people who have it, there are not many who devote it to rocketry. There's not another Musk who would buy the asset. Was him.
I understand that happened, but I mean, the story of Thomas Edison, right? You could say the asset was Edison, but he was thrown out of his own company.
True. Much later.
And well, while he was running it, the company didn't prosper very much. GE prospered post Edison, not with Edison. Their prosperity was post Edison. And people could say the asset of Edison Electric was Thomas Edison, and what was proved that was not the case. Okay, he got tossed out.
It depends on stages, right? So in the early stage, Edison's the asset, and it doesn't exist unless he built that team around him in Menlo Park in New Jersey. And with that team of constant experimentation, constant iteration, came up with a lot of great inventions, the light bulb being the most famous, right? But at another stage, he's not a company builder. That takes professional management to build General Electric into a great company. The person who invented the telegraph also didn't succeed at running AT&T, which one of the T's originally stood for telegraph. You need certain geniuses at certain stages. Very rarely is a genius, a visionary, suitable for all stages of business development, right? General Motors was an okay company until Sloan took it over in the 1920s and professionalized it and operationalized it and made it into a giant. There are different skills at different stages. The person who takes it from 0 to 10 million is different from the person who takes it from 100 million to 1 billion.
Yeah, my only point with that is I don't know at the point in time if that last one blew up, whether none of us know whether the government going in and continuing to subsidize it, that nobody else would have tried to do something with it, and whether they might not have been able to cut a deal with Musk that at that point in his life he might have accepted. You never know until you experience those circumstances. Sometimes people say yes to things you would think that they would never say yes to, and maybe the Elon Musk back then is different than the Elon Musk today, because the Elon Musk today, has $300 billion or whatever he has, of net worth. So,
I think we can both agree that it was a strategic mistake of South Africa to let someone of his talent leave the country. They should have presented so many great incentives for a free market economy that he could have innovated there and helped that country. And it's a strategic benefit of the United States that we had a healthy enough environment to attract him. And the question that every political class of every country should ask is, how do we make such an attractive, dynamic society that the greatest minds, the best innovators come here?
Well, I can tell you one attribute of a great mind and a great innovator, somebody that's self-confident, and can back it up, not just self-confident and can't back it up, as you said, that those are people who tend to like to have a lot of degree of freedom, and they have a lot of choices. So, I read a book years ago, when I became, when I started my own business and I was very young and didn't know really how to run a business. I read this book by two guys from Harvard, that ran in the Harvard negotiation projects, Lax and Sabinius, I think, were the names. And they wrote a book called Management by Negotiation, and so, they said that really a good boss learns that if you want to have good people, you don't tell them what to do, because the good people will leave if you tell them what to do. You have to create an environment that has good people wanting to stay, and that's the value of the business, is being able to retain the best human capital. And the best way to retain the best human capital is to figure out how you make them successful, not how you order them around and boss them around. Is, you give them the freedom, and you provide the best way for them to be successful. And if you do a good job at that, you'll retain them, and they'll help you make a lot of money. So that made a lot of sense when I read that, and I tried to, embrace those principles, and that's the reality of life.
But finding and keeping talent isn't just a problem for a company.
The best talent can
It's
go
also
anywhere.
a problem for a country, right? And we're not thinking about that as a country. How do we attract the best talent, and how do we keep them here, right? And that is, we understand it perfectly in the micro. How does a company do that? And how does a company do that exceptionally well, right? But how does a country do that? That's the question we're not even.
The country does it by creating the best infrastructure and institutions to let people become successful, not to help them be successful, but to provide the environment that lets them, give them the freedom to demonstrate what they're capable of doing. That's, so in other words, it eliminates all the barriers to entry of people becoming successful. So,
exactly. I think you're right.
You want to eliminate barriers to entry. You don't need to give them money. You need to eliminate barriers to entry. Okay?
Exactly.
So many countries have too many barriers to entry, and part of it is because many countries also are know-who countries, so getting the best talent is not so important, because you don't have to be the best, most successful business. Where you need the best talent is where there's a lot of competition. Where there's competition, you got to be the best. Where there's an absence of competition, because you've been able to deter entry, there's no return from having the best people. You don't need the best people, because you've knocked out all the competition. So given the fact that there's an absence of competition, you don't need to have the best people. But with this competitive intensity, then you need the best people, because you got to outcompete everyone else. So it's basically, if there's the cream rises to the top, so if you have a lot of competition and you let competition thrive, then the best people will be able to emerge on top. If you have regulated industries, then basically I don't get necessarily a high return, from the incremental talent. That's why, for years, the talent in Wall Street was much more than they were at banks. Why? The banks was a heavily regulated industry, and Wall Street was not so heavily regulated. So the smarter people, so most of the bankers were people who couldn't get hired on Wall Street. So, or the people got fired at Wall Street, ended up in banks. So, I learned that, when I started my career at the Salomon Brothers, and I went to National Bank of Detroit, went the other way from Wall Street to a bank, and then started my own company. And the bank I went to, by my observation is, friends of mine at the bank, they used to have a joke, is that we recruit the best and retain the rest. So the policy is that they brought people in from the top universities, put them through a 2-year training, and then got rid of them all, but thought that maybe the interaction of them with the older bankers, would make the older bankers, a little bit smarter, by being surrounded by young talent, and they kept replenishing the talent, the young talent pool. But after 2 years, they left. And what was the strategy? The talent was to always have a pool of young talent, but never have the point where they would ever accumulate benefits that you'd have to pay out. They didn't want to have them earn pensions or things like that. So they wanted to have it, get them young in their career when you could pay them low salaries. Have them contribute because they're really smart. And then 2 years later, you throw them out and you replace them with a whole new generation of young people who you throw out in no 2 years, and then you keep replacing them because that's what happened. Almost nobody, the top talent they kept basically throwing out after 2 years, and it was the mediocre talent that stayed around because at the end of the day, having that top talent, they couldn't compensate them enough to stay there. Because they couldn't make enough money off of them because of how regulated the industry is. You might have these really smart people, but that doesn't mean you can make a lot of money off those really smart people because the activities that you can engage in, are so limited to be able to produce the type of returns that they could get on Wall Street.
Look, in a successful society, people who think should not be controlled and coerced by people who don't think. Yeah. And the problem with regulated industries is not that they're captured by inside interests. Yes, that's true. It's that they know nothing and they learn nothing, and yet they exert incredible power. And so the smart people move away from those industries and innovation dies, which is actually what the regulators want because it makes their job easier. It's easier to manage a museum than it is a raucous bazaar. But all the excitement, all the interesting new things are going on in the bazaar.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. When I went to, for me, my goal was to start my own firm by the time I was 30 years old. That was my objective. So I wanted to learn to develop.
Why was that your objective?
What?
Why?
Because I never wanted to answer to anyone else.
It wasn't about money, was it? It was about freedom, wasn't it?
No, only about freedom. I never thought about the money.
Yeah.
Never thought about the money. So
I think people who do think about the money succeed, or do you think people who think about something other than money succeed?
My experience has been that most people who are really successful don't think about the money.
Right.
So that's my impression from the people I've interacted with in my life. So so for me, I was at Solomon Brothers, doing very well at Solomon Brothers. I designed this financial engineering project. One of the salespeople asked me to pitch it to this bank. Now, I always refused. I never would go to meet customers. Never. Okay. So I didn't want to be bothered with people. So I wanted to sit and think and be left alone. So I wanted to leave other people alone. And I wanted them to leave me alone. So, but I got approached one day by this guy, Bill Melchione. Okay. What was unique about Bill Melchione? Okay. It was not that he was a great salesman or anything like that. I didn't even know him, but he used to play for professional basketball. He played in the ABA for the New York Nets. Cool. So I wanted to hang out with Bill Melchione, and because I wanted to talk basketball with him. So the only reason I agreed to go see this bank was to hang out with Bill Melchione and ask him a lot of questions, about his experience playing for the Nets. So he played with Julius Erving and some other great, ABA players who later became good NBA players. Charlie Scott and some, other people. And so I wanted to hear his basketball stories. So that was the only reason why I did it. So I go pitch the National Bank of Detroit, this financial engineering product I designed. And it just so happened that the guy who headed up, the area at the bank who was listening to the pitch, he spent his whole life working at the U.S. Treasury. He had retired. And post-retirement, he was hired by the bank. He was a University of Chicago PhD, like I'm a Chicago graduate. So I give the presentation, and he says to me after the presentation, I want to invite you to dinner at my home. So I asked Melchione, I said, do you mind if I stay and catch a flight tomorrow because I'm here? You're paying for my trip here. So I can't make this decision without you blessing it. So Melchione said, yeah, stay, have a good time. So when I got to this guy's house, I went to his house for dinner. Wonderful person, Edward Snyder, one of the most wonderful people I've met in my life. And he said to me, Jeff, you went to University of Chicago. I said, Right? How'd you know? He said, because of the way you presented it, the way you expressed your ideas and how you thought through the problem. I could see that's a University of Chicago trained person. So I said, I don't know whether to take it as a compliment or insult. So there's a whole bunch of people who are just like me. I don't like to think of that. You're saying there's nothing unique about me. He said, no, 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 I'm not saying that, but you have a way of thinking about things that you probably studied at Chicago. And so I wanted to ask you, I said, yeah, I studied Chicago. So then he said, I also got a sense when you were talking about it, the passion you had for what you work, I don't think you care about money. So we need a lot of help at the bank, and I will let you do whatever you want to do at the bank. You'll have no job description. I'll provide all the political cover for you. I can't pay you anything near what you make at Solomon Brothers, but you'll learn a lot because I'll get you exposure to every part of the bank you want to have exposed to. So the CFO is very close with me, and I will get his authorization that you can do whatever you want to do here. And it doesn't mean you can't listen, but all the research you want to do, all the advice you want to give, I'm not going to put any limitations, and I will make sure that you don't have any political interference with we have great data here, we have all these systems here, all this other stuff. So I said, this I'm going to learn. So that's all I cared about. I didn't care about that I was going to take, compensation cut, more than 50%. I'm 23 years old. What do I give a shit? So I just want to learn because I don't want to be I don't want to rely upon wages. I would have viewed myself as failure if my life depended upon what other people were willing to pay me as a wage. I didn't want to be a wage worker. No way in my life did I want to be a wage worker. I went to accumulate human capital so I could be an entrepreneur. And I thought what I could learn, I felt I learned what I was going to learn at Solomon Brothers. Now I wanted to learn at a bank, and I was being told I was going to have the opportunity of learning whatever I did. And at the bank, I developed my risk management model, which was my first business that I sold, for a lot of money, by the time I was 25. So I left the bank after a little over a year. But yes, I think the fact that I just wanted to learn and I wanted to accrue human capital, and I never gave any consideration to, making decisions based upon, short-term financial consequences. I think that's short-term thinking. I think you got to keep figuring out how you can make yourself smarter and wiser, and then ultimately figure out something that other people will value. And if you're good at doing that, the reward will come along with that. So, but the culture. I can tell you, one day, the bank had a rule about how you change. I ran the bank funding desk, so basically, I was responsible. Also, one of the things, I ran other things in the bank besides that, but I funded the bank and I invested all the bank capital. So I had a lot of responsibilities at the bank. One of the things, I was one who changed the prime rate. And then the prime rate was important because most of the loans were priced off the prime rate. So I was told by the chairman of the bank, who said, Jeff, I want you to know one thing here, the prime rate here, you're upset for it, but I want to just let you know, we kind of have a formula that you can't set the rate until two money center banks change the prime rate. So you have discretion after that, but you have no discretion until two money center banks move. Then use your discretion. So, so I had built this model to predict increases or decreases in the money supply. And at that point in time, whatever the money supply was announced on Thursday, and money supply, changes would have a big impact on interest rates. So I wanted to be able to be a faster mover changing the prime rate. So, so I call up human resources and I tell them, I want to know, do I have the discretion to change the prime rate at my discretion? And the human resource said, yes. Why are you asking this question? So, but that there's a tradition here. I said, yes, I understand the tradition, but I want to know, am I obligated to finance tradition? No, there's a tradition here, so you should follow tradition. But are you saying it's a rule, and are you breaking a policy of the bank, an official policy of the bank, by doing it? No, you're not breaking a policy, but you're breaking a tradition. So I just basically said, I don't give a fuck about tradition. So I just changed the prime rate, and it made the bank a lot more money by me being a faster mover, because if I would have waited for the money center banks, I would have lost the rate increase over the weekend. So I would have lost 2 days, and 2 days of a small amount of interest on a large amount of money is a lot. So to the spread. So, then I got a call from the chairman, who tells me, you understood the tradition. I said, yeah, I know, I understand the tradition, but I'm not a big believer in tradition. So he said, well, because you're an executive officer of the bank, the appropriate thing is that you come in front of the board and explain your behavior to the board, and the board will determine your future at the bank. So I call my wife and I say, be prepared for me to get fired. So I went to the board, and the board said, I went to the board and I said, look, you know what, whatever you decide, I don't give a shit. Okay. And I'm not giving an explanation. Okay. So my explanation is very simple. I had the authority to do it. I'm told you paid me to use my best judgment. I used my best judgment. My best judgment made money for the bank, and I don't give a shit about your tradition. So if you're going to keep me, you got to understand is I don't give a shit about your tradition. I'm going to continue to do what I want to do as long as I'm allowed to do it, and if you change my job, I might quit, or you can just fire me because you think I'm someone who, is not healthy to have around, but I don't want to listen to anything you have to say because I don't think I really need to explain. I will explain myself, but I'm not going to justify myself. And what you have to say is of no interest to me. And I just walked out of the meeting. After that, that's when I called my wife. And I said, I just had this meeting. I'm just waiting to be fired. So we'll probably be moving back to New York. So they never fired me. But I think like the one thing I respect about, Elon Musk, and I'm not going to compare myself to Elon Musk because he's significantly more successful than me in some respects. Now, my success has never required a government bailout, though, or a subsidy. But I think for entrepreneurs to really be successful, you have to have that mentality. You have to have enough confidence in yourself, to just do what you think is right, and understand that there might be consequences to it, and ultimately you're willing to bear the cost of that, because you value your freedom, and you value your integrity, and you're not going to sacrifice it, to keep having a paycheck coming in.
Yeah, I don't waste any time comparing myself to other people. I'm running my own race, and I think a lot of people do waste their own time comparing themselves. Jones has a bigger house or makes more money or has got a nicer sounding job or a better looking spouse or whatever, right? Smarter goldfish, who knows? And it's just a loser's game. Live your life, you follow your goals and measure yourself. Are you achieving your goals as effectively and as efficiently and as quickly as you can? Don't worry about other people's goals and other people's journeys. That's like comparing, holiday vacation destinations. Like this person went here and now you're gonna. It's silly. But there's a lot of people who spend their time comparing themselves to other people, and I just don't know why. That puzzles me. It sounds like you're the same. You never spend a moment thinking that you should be Elon Musk. You're happy being Jeff Wernick, and
yes,
that's very healthy.
Yeah, I want to be authentic. So that's I respect authenticity, and I want to be authentic. And I think the people that know me well, whether they like me or not, I think most people who get to meet me and get to know me, understand that I'm an authentic person. So
I mean, I've come close to death several times in my life as a war zone correspondent and as a, Irish American in his late 50s. Various events have said, you could die very soon, right? And at each one of those times I reflected on, I said, I'm basically happy. I've lived the life I wanted to live. If you spend your life comparing yourselves to other people at those life and death moments, you won't have the happiness and the confidence to say that. And that's unfortunate, right? So I think people would be better off living, the way that you and I have, Jeff, living your own life. And it's not about the number of material possessions or anything transitory and shallow as that. It's, have you lived your life on your terms and got to do the things that were valuable to you?
Agreed. Now, now this has been a wonderful conversation, and you're a great person to have a conversation with. Even if it's not nice that we can disagree in such an agreeable way. Which I really appreciate and respect. I'd like to, I always like to give my guest the last word, but one of the things I would ask you to include as part of your last words is not only if you could tell people about when it's clear that you're a public intellectual, people should read, or wherever you put content up, people should be aware to find the content you put up wherever you put it up, because you're a public intellectual, very worthwhile for people to get more exposure to. But you also have your own business activities, so why don't you do a little commercial and describe whatever else you want to tell this audience, and also to talk about how people can find you, and also about the businesses that you're engaged in.
Sure. Well, I have a number of books on Amazon. I haven't written anything in a new book in 10 years. I've been spending the last 10 years building a new business, which I'll talk about at another time. But it will be, I think it's a journey that's given me a lot of meaning. And I think when the world is ready to hear about it, I think millions of people will be very interested in what I'm doing. Because I'm getting sort of more pressure to come back into public life and start giving interviews like this one, and writing again for the public. I am starting a Substack, so people can find Richard Miniter on Substack starting next week. But other than that, I don't post on social media. I give very few speeches in public these days. I've kind of retreated from the world to focus on my business and on some personal writing that I'm doing. But I've decided to open one little window, which is Substack, and people can follow me there. But if you see my name on Twitter or anywhere else, it's almost certainly an impersonation. I don't spend any time consuming or producing social media. I'm happy to have conversations with people I respect, like you, Jeff, and I'm happy to do more of that. But generally, I don't want to get into the scrum of these Twitter fights and these things that people do. I don't think it makes sense to argue with people who don't have anything meaningful to teach me. I want to be engaged in meaningful conversations with fair-minded interlocutors like yourself, Jeff. And I don't want to get into fights with people who grab a random phrase and assume a worldview and make all sorts of accusations. That is arguing with an NPC, and I just don't see the point of that. Maybe other people do. I'm not judging people who do. They're welcome to do that. But I like meaningful conversations that make me smarter and better. And I think there's probably millions of other people in the world who are actually look for that too. They want to become smarter and better through what they used to call in the 18th century improving conversations. But shouting matches on TV and on social media, I don't do television appearances anymore, and very few radio appearances, just for that reason. I prefer much more curated conversations with people who are truly fair-minded and interested and interesting to me.
I have a question. Do you have in mind your first piece for your Substack?
I have a couple of ideas in mind. Yes.
Okay. And so people could expect to look for you next week? You think you'll have
next week on Substack? Yes. And I will talk about economics, politics, and most of all, history. I think what the national conversation is missing in any particular area is how we got here, right? What is the story that led to this point? And I think that's a contribution that I could make. Also, I think a wider frame of intellectual reference would also be beneficial to the conversation, which I think I could bring. So I'm not going to be writing op-eds arguing for or against any political party or project, but I am going to be writing about ideas that matter, that help you understand the world.
And how do people find your excellent interview with the other podcast that you sent me? Can I
name the other podcast?
Excuse me?
Can I name the other podcast?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the Trigonometry podcast, which you can find on YouTube, and other places, Spotify. And these are two British stand-up comedians who a few years ago launched their own podcast to talk to interesting people. They happened to bump into me and have me on, and I was delighted they did. It's about to pass 500,000 views on YouTube alone, and probably that again on other social outlets. And it's called Triggernometry, the word trigger and then Nometry. And I hope people tune in. And it's about the early days of American history and how 4 different subcultures founded different portions of America and how it led to the people we are today.
It's a great way to spend time for anyone that has intellectual curiosity on this topic, and I think every American should have interested in the roots of the country. So so we can each make the country better by understanding much more where we came from, and to really understand why we have some of the differences we have. And if we have better understanding of why we have these differences, maybe we'll become better at resolving these differences. So and Richard did a really, really great job, and it's a great interview, and I really encourage people to go there and watch it. So Richard, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really wonderful 2 hours. It's always good to have a conversation with you. This might be the longest conversation we've had. So I've really enjoyed it, and I want to thank you so much.
Well, we can have other conversations at other times.
I would look forward to that. Okay, love to have you back. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye.
Bye.